Hello, my name is Angie. 6 years ago, my own mother looked me in the eye at my engagement party and said, "He settled for you." Days later, she stood beside my fiancé, and replaced me with herself. Since then, she's worn my wedding dress, silenced my invitations, and rewritten the story of my life as if I were never meant to exist. Yesterday, I found the letter he wrote before our wedding, proof that she threatened him into leaving me. But what else has she hidden from me all these years? I can still remember the glow of the candles flickering against the high ceilings of my mother's Victorian home in Cleveland. The house had always been her stage, every corner curated to impress. Tonight, it was dressed in lace tablecloths, silver trays stacked with hors d'oeuvres, and rows of champagne glasses catching the light. Guests murmured and laughed in the parlor, balancing their plates while making small talk. Their smiles seemed polite, but their eyes carried a weight that made me tighten my grip on Cormac's arm. It should have been one of the happiest nights of my life, our engagement party, the moment to celebrate the future I had dreamed of. Yet even as I smiled at relatives who hadn't seen me in years, I felt my mother's eyes on me. Isolde stood by the fireplace, her posture perfect, her lips curved in a smile that never reached her eyes. Every laugh that floated from her lips felt rehearsed. Every gesture meant to remind everyone who really commanded the room. I wanted so badly to believe she was proud of me, but I had lived too long under her gaze not to recognize the sharpness behind it. Growing up in the Midwest, family dinners were less about warmth and more about appearances. In many families here, I once read, the dining room table feels less like a place to break bread and more like a courtroom. Tonight, I felt like the defendant, and my mother was presiding judge. Cormac leaned close, whispering, "You look beautiful tonight." His words steadied me for a moment, though I caught the glance he stole toward my mother. She smiled back at him, and for reasons I couldn't name, the sight set something uneasy stirring inside me. As the evening stretched, glasses were refilled, plates cleared, and at last the moment came for my mother to raise a toast. The room quieted, the clinking of forks fading as she lifted her champagne flute. My heart beat fast, expecting her to speak words of blessing, of approval. Instead, she looked at Cormac, then at me, her smile widening before she spoke. "Let's be honest," she said, her voice clear enough for every corner of the room to hear. "He settled for you." The words dropped like ice water across the table. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Glasses hung mid-air, relatives exchanged glances, whispers rippled in the silence. My cheeks burned hot as if all the oxygen had been pulled from the room. Cormac shifted uncomfortably beside me, his hand tightening slightly on my shoulder. But he said nothing. He didn't object. He didn't defend me. He just looked down into his glass, as though the words weren't worth fighting against. Inside, humiliation spread like a fire. I thought of my father, Anselm, who used to tell me, "Dignity is what you hold when the world tries to strip it away." I forced myself to remember that. And I remembered the words of Eleanor Roosevelt, words I had once underlined in a book. "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." I clung to that sentence as if it were armor. So I smiled. A small, faint smile that masked the boiling storm inside me. I refused to let her see me crumble, though I could feel the sting of every stare, every whisper. The night continued as though nothing had been said, though I carried those words like a stone pressing on my chest. Later, as guests lingered near the dessert table, I found myself cornered by a cousin who leaned close, her perfume cloying as she whispered with a smirk, "She's lucky he even chose her." It wasn't just my mother. The poison had already begun to spread. My humiliation had become a family anecdote, a story to be shared and laughed about in corners. I felt my jaw tighten, my pulse quicken. I faced her directly, forcing calm into my voice. "Do you really believe that's something worth saying?" She blinked, caught off guard, her smirk faltering. Around us, the air thickened. A few relatives nearby turned their heads, pretending not to listen but leaning closer all the same. My cousin stammered, muttering something about, "just a joke," before retreating. That silence, that brief, weighted silence, was mine. It was the only strike I allowed myself, subtle but sharp enough to slice through her smugness. Still, it left me shaken. I realized that if I said nothing, if I simply smiled through each insult, I was complicit in my own diminishment. The evening wound down slowly, conversations turning softer, glasses emptied, goodbyes exchanged. But the bitterness clung to me long after the last guest's coat was gathered. I excused myself before dessert was served, stepping out into the crisp night air. The garden lights glowed faintly against the darkness, casting long shadows over the manicured hedges. I breathed deeply, trying to balance the joy I had felt at the thought of my future with the sting of what my mother had done to me. I could hear the laughter inside, her voice rising above the rest, commanding attention as always. I thought of my father then, of the way he would place his hand over mine at the table and remind me, "Hold steady, you're stronger than you know." His absence weighed on me more heavily than ever. Had he been alive, he would never have let her words hang unchallenged. He would have stood, cleared his throat, and reminded the room who I was. But he wasn't there. And so it was up to me to decide how much of myself I would allow my mother to erase. I stayed there a long moment, the cold air biting at my cheeks, before I finally turned back toward the house. I didn't know it then, but that one sentence, "He settled for you," was the spark that would burn down everything I thought was mine. When I stepped back inside the house, the warmth of the party pressed in on me again, but it wasn't comforting. The first thing I heard was my mother's laughter carrying above everyone else's, as if she had orchestrated the entire room. People gravitated toward her the way plants lean toward the sun, even though her light was the kind that burned more than it nurtured. I paused near the door, taking in the sight of her standing at the center of a group of relatives, her hand fluttering as she spoke, drawing out gasps of amusement. My engagement celebration, yet it felt like her show. That knot of unease that had formed outside twisted tighter in my stomach. I told myself, this is my night, not hers, but even in thinking it, I knew it wasn't true. Growing up in a family like ours, every milestone, graduations, birthdays, engagements, turned into stages where my mother could demonstrate her control. In many American families, moments meant for joy become battlegrounds of pride and dominance. Tonight was no different. She was the lead actress, and I was a prop in the background. I forced a smile as guests brushed past, offering compliments that sounded rehearsed. One aunt clasped my hand and said, "You must be thrilled." But her eyes flicked toward my mother, waiting for her cue before holding the smile a beat longer. My chest tightened. This wasn't a celebration of my love story. It was another showcase of hers. I took Cormac's arm again, hoping his presence might anchor me. He was speaking with one of my uncles, laughing politely, when I noticed her drift closer to him. At first, I thought nothing of it. She often mingled, fluttering from conversation to conversation like a queen inspecting her court. But then her hand brushed against Cormac's sleeve as she leaned in to make a point. To anyone else, it might have looked casual. But to me, it lingered a fraction too long, her fingers trailing lightly as she laughed. Cormac chuckled, tilting his head toward her, and I felt my breath catch. It wasn't the laugh he gave me, the one reserved for our private jokes. This laugh was easier, looser, almost conspiratorial. My heart sank as the unease hardened into suspicion. Am I imagining this? I asked myself. Am I so wound up from her earlier insult that I'm seeing things that aren't there? Maya Angelou's words floated up in my memory, words I had once underlined in the margin of a book. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. But what if what I saw was only my mother being her dramatic self? What if I was misreading the way Cormac leaned in, the way his smile seemed too willing? I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nerves, but the image stayed with me, replaying like a film clip stuck on loop. The evening dragged on, conversation and clinking glasses covering my unease, until I excused myself under the pretense of checking on the kitchen. I needed a moment away from the crowd, a moment to breathe. As I neared the swinging kitchen door, I slowed. Through the half-open gap, I caught sight of something that made my legs turn to stone. My mother was standing close to Cormac, her hands reaching up to adjust his tie. Their faces were far too near, laughter soft between them like a shared secret. My throat went dry as I watched his hand lift, fingers brushing her wrist in thanks. The world seemed to tilt under me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. For an instant, the kitchen noise, the clatter of plates, the faint hum of the refrigerator, faded, and all I heard was their laughter, intimate and easy. I stumbled back, heart hammering so loudly I was certain someone would hear it. My palms grew slick with sweat, my entire body rigid with disbelief. Is this betrayal? I asked myself. Or am I inventing stories because I can't bear to think my mother would cross such a line? Denial rushed in, desperate to save me. Americans often tell themselves, it's just nothing, because facing heartbreak head-on feels unbearable. Maybe she was fussing like she always did. Maybe he was only being polite. Maybe I was wrong. I backed away before they saw me, slipping into the hallway, forcing my breathing to slow. I couldn't confront them here, not with the entire family under the same roof. My fear and anger tangled inside me, a knot I couldn't untie. By the time I rejoined the dinner table, my face was carefully composed. I sat beside Cormac as though nothing had happened, picking at my food, each bite tasting like chalk. My mother's eyes flicked toward me, her lips curving into a smile that pierced my composure. It was the smile of someone who knew she had unsettled me and relished the victory. A cousin raised his glass, complimenting Cormac for being such a perfect fit for the family. My mother leaned in, answering smoothly, "Oh, he's practically family already." The words sliced through me, a reminder of what I had seen in the kitchen. My grip tightened on my fork, knuckles pale, but I said nothing. Inside, I recited Eleanor Roosevelt's words again, words I had clung to at the toast. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. But I couldn't shake the gnawing question. Was my silence strength, or was it weakness? I sat there, the noise of conversations swirling around me, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. My anger was no longer fiery. It had turned inward, quiet and contained, a storm waiting to be released. And then, I noticed her again. My mother's eyes lingered on Cormac as he spoke, the corners of her smile daring me to notice. That was when it hit me. She wasn't just trying to ruin my night. She was plotting to take something far bigger. That night, after the last guest had left and the house settled into silence, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The glow from the street lamp outside filtered through the curtains, faint but enough to remind me that I wasn't dreaming. My mind replayed the images again and again. My mother's hand grazing Cormac's sleeve, her fingers on his tie, their laughter mingling in a way that felt too familiar, too intimate. I turned onto my side, trying to push the memory away, but my stomach knotted with unease. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, to chalk it up to nerves from the evening's earlier humiliation. But another voice whispered louder, the one my father had etched into me years ago. When your gut whispers, it's rarely lying. I reached for my phone, scrolling through Cormac's messages. Most of them were ordinary, quick notes about scheduling, short affirmations, even a few reminders about bills. But something felt off. One thread seemed unusually thin, as though parts of the conversation had been deleted. My chest tightened. I knew many women in their 30s who had told me of nights like this, lying awake, staring at messages that didn't add up, torn between trusting the man they loved and listening to the gnawing sense that something was wrong. I hadn't wanted to be one of them. But as I set the phone back down, I realized I already was. When Cormac visited the next morning, his laptop bag sat open on the counter. He had gone into the bathroom, leaving the screen glowing. I don't know what made me lean closer. Curiosity, maybe, or fear. But what I found wasn't something I could ever unsee. There it was, a forwarded email from my mother. Subject line, club meeting. The words in the body chilled me. We should handle this before Valora notices. My heart hammered as my eyes scanned the screen. Handle what? Why would my mother be emailing my fiancé privately about meetings and strategies? My hands trembled so badly, I had to grip the edge of the counter to steady myself. By the time he returned, I had already taken a screenshot with my phone. I held it out to him the moment he walked into the room. Why is my mother writing to you like this? My voice cracked, sharp with disbelief. He froze, the color draining slightly from his face. Where did you get that? Does it matter where I got it? Answer me, Cormac. What does she mean by before I notice? He hesitated, then tried a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Valora, it's nothing. She was talking about planning details for the party. You're overreacting. I stared at him, my chest heaving. Party details? My mother doesn't plan in secret, and she certainly doesn't tell you to hide things from me. His jaw tightened. This is what you always do, he snapped. You read too much into things. You twist innocent details into something sinister. I blinked at him, stunned by the shift. Excuse me? You're paranoid, he said, louder now, his voice firm like a verdict. That's the real problem. You have trust issues. Not me. Not your mother. You. The floor felt like it was tilting. Trust issues. Cormac, I saw the email with my own eyes. Don't stand here and make me question reality. He shook his head, exasperated. Do you even hear yourself? She was helping me with arrangements, making sure things ran smoothly. You should be grateful, not suspicious. My throat tightened, fury and hurt colliding inside me. Grateful? After everything she said last night? After the way she humiliated me in front of everyone? And now you're having secret conversations with her about things I'm not supposed to notice? He raised his hands in frustration. You're impossible when you get like this, always looking for betrayal where there isn't any. This is exactly why your mother worries about you. That last sentence cut sharper than the rest. My own mother, worrying about me, with him, behind my back. I wanted to scream, to shake him, but instead I fell into silence. A phrase I had once heard came back to me. Gaslighting makes you question the fire when you're already burning. That was what was happening. I was burning, and he was telling me it was only smoke. I retreated to the backyard while he stayed inside, muttering to himself about how unreasonable I was. The cool morning air hit my face, and I sank onto the patio chair, gripping the arms as though they might anchor me. The neighborhood was quiet, the soft chirp of birds at odds with the storm inside me. I listened to the faint rustle of leaves, trying to slow my breathing. Inside, chaos. Out here, calm. The contrast made me feel like I was living two lives. I whispered to myself, in American families, silence often covers what no one dares to speak aloud. And in that moment, I understood what silence meant for me. It was not peace. It was a shield, one I was using to protect myself even as it suffocated me. This was the first time I admitted to myself that my relationship with Cormac was not just fragile. It was already cracking. My trust in him had fissured like glass, and I knew the damage couldn't simply be smoothed over. Yet I resolved then and there that I wouldn't let emotions make me reckless. I would watch. I would wait. But the sense of betrayal clung to me like smoke on clothing after a fire. Through the open window, I heard her voice again. My mother's laughter, rich and commanding, mingling with Cormac's. My chest tightened, and my nails dug into the wood of the chair. And in that moment, hearing them together, I knew I wasn't paranoid. I was standing at the edge of a betrayal I wasn't ready to face. The weekend came faster than I wanted it to. After the unsettling days that followed the engagement party, I felt as if the ground beneath me hadn't steadied. Still, when my mother announced a family dinner at one of the more polished restaurants in downtown Cleveland, I knew I couldn't refuse. These dinners weren't invitations, they were commands dressed up as courtesies. Cormac and I arrived together, walking into the warm glow of chandeliers and the clatter of silverware against china. The restaurant buzzed with conversation, but when I stepped into the private dining room, the noise seemed to dull. My mother was already seated at the head of the long table, perfectly framed by the room's ornate mirror, her presence immediately shifting the air. Relatives were arranged on either side of her like courtiers, their faces alight with the approval of simply being close. I sat beside Cormac, my palms damp, stomach tense. I could feel it even before she opened her mouth. She was preparing to perform again. The evening unfolded with her voice guiding every topic, every laugh. Even small remarks about the wine somehow circled back to her judgment. And though I nodded and smiled, I knew what was coming. Family dinners in households like ours were rarely about food. They were examinations, staged scenes where reputations could be elevated or shredded. Tonight, I was about to be dissected. Halfway through the meal, she lifted her glass. The room hushed with practiced obedience. "To Cormac," she said brightly, her eyes shining with false warmth. Then her smile sharpened. "Let's be honest. He deserves someone stronger. Valora is lucky he chose her at all." Gasps rippled across the table. A cousin coughed, trying to disguise the shock, while others lowered their eyes to their plates. Cormac's lips pulled into a strained smile, his gaze darting briefly to me before dropping again. My hands tightened beneath the table, nails biting into my skin as though to anchor me. Heat flared across my face, but I forced myself to remain still. I felt like a specimen under glass, stripped of dignity while the audience looked on. I remembered words I had once underlined in a book. Family should be your shelter, not your storm. Yet here I sat, drenched in the rain of her cruelty, while everyone else simply braced themselves not to be struck. I took a sip of water, the glass trembling slightly in my hand, and swallowed every response I wanted to hurl across the table. Rage pressed against my throat, but I knew if I let it free, she would win again. Silence was the only weapon I had left in that moment. The conversation limped forward after her toast, scattered attempts to restore normalcy. But the damage lingered. Every glance I caught from relatives was heavy with pity, each one branding me weaker. Later that evening, new guests arrived, family friends and a business acquaintance of my mother's. She rose gracefully to greet them, gliding across the room like the hostess of a grand gala. I watched from my chair as she extended her hand, and with that same sweet tone she had mastered over decades, said, "This is my youngest, the one who still hasn't quite settled her life yet." The words slid through me like a blade. To the guests, it sounded affectionate, a playful introduction. But to me, it was deliberate, a reminder that in her story, I would always be unfinished, inadequate. They smiled at me politely, their eyes softened with pity. I hated that look. It was the same expression people give to a child who has fallen behind, a mix of sympathy and superiority. I steadied my breath and forced a small smile. "Yes," I said, my voice level. "Still figuring things out." "But better that than pretending." Her lips twitched, just slightly, the briefest flicker of irritation before she turned back to her guests. For the first time that night, I felt a sliver of victory, even if it was small and private. The meal dragged on, but I had already checked out. My body remained at the table, but my mind walked out into the night. I could no longer sit under the weight of her staged humiliation. I excused myself early, murmuring that I wasn't feeling well. Cormac looked at me with concern, but he didn't protest. My mother barely acknowledged my departure, too consumed with her performance for the newcomers. The cold air outside hit me with relief. I walked through the Cleveland streets with my coat pulled tight, heels clicking against the pavement. My thoughts boiled with everything I hadn't said. Strangers passed me, their expressions indifferent, and I realized their indifference hurt less than the barbed words of my own mother. I stopped under a streetlight, breath fogging in the night, and admitted to myself what I had been denying. Her pattern was clear. She undermined me, controlled the narrative, dominated every space we shared. And if I kept silent, she would continue rewriting my life until there was nothing of me left. By the time I reached home, I had already typed a message to Cormac. "We need to talk seriously about boundaries." My hands trembled as I pressed send, but not from fear. It was the tremble of resolve, the kind that builds when you know a reckoning is coming. And as I set the phone down, I knew one thing for certain. If I stayed silent, my mother would write the story of my life, and she'd cast me as the failure. The apartment was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I sat across from Cormac at the small kitchen table, the lamplight cutting sharp shadows across his face. The humiliation from the family dinner was still burning in my chest. I had swallowed enough of my mother's poison, and I could feel something inside me hardening. I leaned forward, my voice low but steady. "If you don't step back from her, then we don't move forward." Cormac blinked, caught off guard by the firmness in my tone. He gave a short laugh as though I had made a joke. Valora, you're blowing this out of proportion. She's your mother. She just has a strong personality. I didn't flinch. This isn't about her personality. This is about boundaries. She doesn't get to humiliate me in front of the entire family, and you don't get to stand by like it doesn't matter. Either you draw a line with her, or we can't build a life together. His smile faded into irritation. You're acting dramatic. You know how she is. She likes control, sure, but it doesn't mean she's trying to hurt you. I held his gaze. She is hurting me, and your silence makes you complicit. I won't keep playing the role she writes for me. Not anymore. The words hung heavy in the air. For a moment, I feared he would dismiss me again, that he would choose the easier path of aligning with her. But I also knew I couldn't back down. In American relationships, setting boundaries is not just healthy, it's survival. And this was my first true stand. That night, he said little more, brushing it off with a sigh and a muttered, "We'll talk later." But I went to bed knowing I had drawn my line in the sand. Whether he stepped over it or stood with me would soon become clear. Weeks passed, filled with tense silences and shallow reassurances. And then came the wedding day. The church glowed with soft light, flowers arranged along the pews, the scent of roses thick in the air. My hands clutched the bouquet tightly as I prepared to walk inside, but whispers met me before I even stepped into the sanctuary. Faces turned. Shock rippled through the crowd. I pushed open the doors and froze. At the altar, standing tall with a pale Cormac by her side, was my mother, and she was wearing my dress, the very gown I had chosen, fitted, and dreamed of, now draped over her like a grotesque trophy. The room spun. For a moment, I thought I must be hallucinating. My heart slammed in my chest, my breath shallow. I forced one word out, barely above a whisper. That's my dress. Isolde turned her head, her eyes glinting with triumph, her lips curved in a calm, cutting smile. No, dear. It looks better on me. The guests shifted uncomfortably, some covering their mouths, others murmuring in disbelief. My entire body felt as though it had turned to glass, transparent, fragile, moments from shattering. Cormac avoided my eyes, his face tight, his silence a betrayal louder than any confession. I had imagined this day 100 different ways, but never like this. Not robbed of dignity, not erased before my own family and friends. Betrayal from strangers' wounds, but betrayal from your blood rewrites the very story of who you are. The air buzzed with shock. Some relatives leaned toward each other, whispering, while others stared openly at the spectacle. I felt my legs weaken, my bouquet slipping slightly in my grip. Cold numbness crept into my bones, dulling the white-hot sting. And then, in the chaos, a hand tugged at my arm. My uncle pressed a small envelope into my palm, his eyes heavy with unspoken sympathy. Your father wanted you to have this, he whispered quickly, glancing toward Isolde as though she might snatch it away even now. I stepped aside into a quiet corner, tearing the seal with trembling hands. Inside was my father's handwriting, familiar, steady. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. To my daughter, on her wedding day, I have always been proud of you. You carry strength in your silence and dignity in your every choice. No matter what life takes from you, never forget who you are. You will never walk alone, for my love goes with you always. I clutched the letter to my chest, the paper soft but grounding, a tether to the truth of my worth. While my mother tried to erase me, my father's voice reached through time to remind me that I was never less, never unworthy. I breathed deeply, his words seeping into the cracks her betrayal had carved in me. When everything is taken from you, I whispered to myself, the one thing left is how you choose to stand. And so I stood. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't give her the spectacle she wanted. I turned on my heel, bouquet forgotten on the floor, shoes clicking against the polished aisle as I walked out. The whispers followed me, trailing like smoke, but I kept my head high. The doors of the church swung shut behind me with a final thud, sealing the moment in memory. My chest rose and fell, the letter pressed tight against me. This day would haunt me, I knew. The image of her in my dress beside the man who should have been mine would sear itself into me forever. But I also knew I had chosen dignity. I would not collapse at her feet. I would not let her rewrite the end of my story. As I stepped into the cool air outside, I made a silent vow. One day the truth would surface. My father's words would not be buried, and neither would I. I wasn't just leaving behind a ruined wedding. I was leaving behind the family that had conspired to erase me. As the church doors shut behind me, I realized I wasn't just walking away from a wedding. I was walking away from my family. The night after the wreckage of my wedding, my apartment felt like a hollow shell. The walls seemed to echo every unanswered question, every betrayal that had unfolded in front of my family and friends. I sat on the edge of my bed, my father's envelope pressed tightly in my hands, the paper soft from my grip. I read his words again and again, as if they might somehow change, as if the ink might rearrange itself into instructions on how to survive this moment. I opened the closet and pulled out a suitcase. Each shirt, each pair of shoes I folded felt less like preparation for a trip, and more like cutting invisible threads tethering me to this city. With every piece of clothing tucked into the bag, I whispered silently, "Gone, gone, gone." My chest ached, but I refused to collapse. Sometimes leaving isn't weakness, it's the only way to stay whole. I had repeated that to myself so many times in my head that night it almost sounded like prayer. My heart was shattered, but beneath the pieces, something harder, sharper, more determined was forming. At the desk, I set a fresh sheet of paper in front of me. I stared at it, the pen heavy in my hand, before finally letting the words pour out. "Mother, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I am no longer your daughter. You may erase me from your stories, but you will never erase my worth. You stole what was mine, and yet I stand here unbroken. I refuse to be part of your empire of lies. Consider this my final act of defiance. I will live without you, and I will live with dignity." I read it twice, making sure there was no trace of pleading. The tone was steady, cold, not a cry for reconciliation, not even anger anymore, just a statement of finality. I folded the paper carefully, slid it into an envelope, and sealed it with a press of my hand. Before dawn, I drove through quiet streets until I reached her house. The grand home looked the same as it always had, polished, commanding, hers. I placed the envelope on the front step, the paper stark against the dark wood, and stood there a moment. My breath clouded in the chill air, but my hands were steady. That letter was my severance, the tangible proof that I had chosen myself over her control. Disownment letters aren't common. In America, when families fracture, people often let silence be the final word. But this letter wasn't silence. It was my declaration that I would no longer carry her chains. The sky had turned gray by the time I pulled into the cemetery. The winter air bit at my face, sharp and unforgiving. Snow dusted the ground, crunching beneath my boots as I walked between the rows of stone. My father's headstone stood quietly among them, his name carved into the granite like an anchor. I knelt, pulling the envelope he had left me from my coat pocket. I read his words once more, my breath fogging the air. Then I whispered, "I will not let her destroy me. I'll carry your dignity instead." A single flower rested in my hand, one I had bought from the corner shop on the way. I laid it gently against the stone, pressing my palm to the cold granite, as if my skin might absorb the strength I imagined he was still offering. Tears fell silently, tracing paths down my cheeks, but they weren't the kind that weakened me. They were the kind that released something I had held too tightly. Grief, after all, is the last act of love we give to those we lost. By the time I rose, the sky was streaked with the first hints of dawn. I walked back to the car, the letter safe in my coat, the flower left as both offering and farewell. The suitcase sat in the back seat, packed with pieces of a life I was abandoning. As I drove out of Cleveland, the skyline receded in my rearview mirror, growing smaller with every mile. The city that had been both my home and my prison slipped further behind me. I didn't know where I was going, only that it had to be away. Away from her reach, away from the story she kept trying to write over my life. I clutched my father's letter one last time at a red light, holding it like a talisman of hope. With every mile I drove, I shed another chain. But I couldn't shake the question. Would I ever be free from her shadow? Months slipped quietly after I left Cleveland. I found myself in a small town tucked in Pennsylvania, teaching literature at a modest college where the students were earnest, and the pace of life was gentle compared to the chaos I had escaped. My new apartment was unremarkable. 2 rooms, a sagging couch, shelves still half empty. But it was mine, and the silence it carried was different from the silence I had known under my mother's roof. In Cleveland, silence was suffocating, a punishment. Here, it was breathable, though lonely. Evenings stretched long. I often graded papers at the kitchen table, the hum of the radiator my only company. I missed the thrum of family life, even with its venom. But when the ache grew sharp, I reminded myself, I had left because survival demanded it. In America, moving away carries 2 stories, one of independence, another of exile. Mine was both. I carried the relief of distance in one hand and the ache of isolation in the other. I had escaped her shadow, but freedom was not the same as family. One rainy afternoon, unpacking a box I had shoved into the closet months ago, I found a stack of old belongings I'd taken in my hurried departure. Beneath yellowed photos and worn novels, I uncovered a journal bound in cracked leather. My breath caught. It was my father's. I sat down immediately, running my fingers over his handwriting, steady and deliberate. On the first page I opened, his words leapt from the paper. Strength isn't in loud voices, but in standing firm when the world denies you. Tears blurred the ink as I read. His encouragement, his faith in me, poured out from the pages as if he had known exactly when I would need it. Each entry carried echoes of conversations we once had, him telling me to hold my head high, to trust that dignity mattered more than approval. For many people my age, rediscovering a parent's words feels like a voice from beyond the grave. For me, it was an anchor. I tore one page carefully, folded it, and slipped it into my wallet. It became my shield, a reminder I could carry into every room where I felt small. Weeks later, Malis arrived from New York. She had been my closest friend since college, the one person who had seen me through every storm. She drove hours just to spend a weekend with me. We sat in the little cafe down the street, mugs of coffee steaming between us. I confessed quietly. Some days I wonder if I made the right choice leaving. Maybe I was too harsh, maybe... She cut me off with a firm shake of her head. No. You made the only choice that let you stay true to yourself. I sighed. But the silence, it's heavy. Malis reached across the table, tapping the journal I had brought along to show her. Then don't fill the silence with doubt. Fill it with this. Your mother can erase letters, hide envelopes, twist stories, but she can't erase your father's faith in you. Her words pierced me, solid and grounding. I realized then that not everyone would betray me. There were voices, my father's, Malis's, that held me steady when the storm tried to drag me under. She was my lifeline, proof that love could exist without manipulation. That night, after Malis left, I lit a single candle in my apartment and opened my father's journal again. The glow flickered against the pages as I wrote my own entry beside his. I will live with dignity, no matter what comes. Her storm may rise again, but it will not drown me. I leaned back, whispering Emily Dickinson's words I had once memorized. Hope is the thing with feathers. My father's steady pen and Malis's unwavering faith had become those feathers, keeping me afloat when I felt like sinking. I didn't know if I would ever face my mother again, but I knew this. When that day came, I would not crumble. I would stand, anchored by the voices that loved me, not the ones that sought to erase me. I didn't know it yet, but the anchor I found in those words would be the very thing that kept me steady when the storm returned. The rain had been falling all morning, drumming steadily against the windows of my small Pennsylvania apartment. On days like that, when the world outside seemed blurred and gray, I turned to cleaning as a way to anchor myself. I pulled out the last unopened boxes I had carried from Cleveland, boxes I had avoided since the day I left. They sat in the corner like silent witnesses, stuffed with the remnants of a life I wasn't sure I wanted to revisit. I slit the first one open, peeling back the tape that had yellowed with time. Inside were old photographs, family gatherings where my mother always positioned herself in the middle, smiling with that rehearsed grace. Beneath the photos lay a stack of worn books, their spines cracked, their pages scented faintly of my father's study. And at the very bottom, wedged between an album and a pile of receipts, was a sealed envelope. The paper was faded, the ink faint, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. My chest tightened. It was Cormac's. His name scrawled across the front, familiar and foreign all at once. My pulse quickened. For a long moment, I just stared. My hand hovered, hesitant. The apartment was quiet except for the rain, and in that silence, the envelope seemed to hum with a weight of its own. I pressed it against my lap, torn between dread and need. My heart pounded as I slid a finger beneath the flap. The letter crackled as I unfolded it. Cormac's handwriting filled the page, slanted and hurried, as though he had written in a rush. "Valora, I love you, but I don't know if I can go through with this. Your mother has made it clear. If I marry you, I risk everything. She has threatened my reputation, hinted at financial consequences, and I'm scared of what she'll reveal. I thought about running away with you, just leaving it all behind. But I don't know if I have the strength. Please forgive me if I falter." The words blurred as tears welled in my eyes. My chest tightened with grief, but behind it came clarity. He hadn't abandoned me out of lack of love. He had been cornered, manipulated. My mother's reach had gone deeper than I had ever imagined. I sat back, the letter trembling in my hands. Letters like this are the last unfiltered truths, glimpses into motives stripped bare. And this truth gutted me. She hadn't only stolen him from me, she had orchestrated the theft. Anger bubbled beneath the grief, searing and sharp. I thought of every whisper, every smirk, every deliberate cut she had delivered. She hadn't just taken a fiancé, she had rewritten history in her favor. As I folded the letter carefully, my fingers brushed against something else tucked in the box. Another envelope, thicker. I pulled it out and froze. It was an unsent wedding invitation, addressed in elegant script to one of my father's old friends. I tore it open. Inside was the printed card, the date, the church, everything exactly as it should have been. Oh, but it had never been mailed. My throat constricted. It was proof, tangible proof, that she hadn't simply stolen my fiancé. She had controlled who would bear witness to the day. She had chosen to isolate me, to limit who knew, to erase me not just in the present, but in the record of memory itself. I gripped the invitation so tightly the edges cut into my palm. "She didn't just steal him," I whispered. "She erased my place in history." The rain outside beat harder, echoing the rage rising inside me. My body trembled, but not with fear anymore, with determination. I laid both the letter and the invitation on the table, staring at them as though they were weapons. I thought of my father's journal, the page I carried in my wallet. Strength isn't in loud voices, but in standing firm when the world denies you. His words steadied me. No more silence, no more allowing her to dictate the story. I would not let her version of events become the only one that survived. "Truth always surfaces," I said aloud, my voice stronger than I expected, "even if someone tries to drown it." I slid both items into my purse, folding them with care. My hands steadied as I zipped the bag shut. I didn't know how or when, but I knew this. The next time I faced my family, I would not come empty-handed. I had the proof she had buried, and I would use it. That night, as the candlelight flickered across the small apartment, I sat staring at the purse on the table. It wasn't just leather and stitching. It was a vault holding the truth I had been denied for 6 years. The letter shook me to my core, but it also gave me something I hadn't had in years, a weapon of truth. The invitation arrived folded in heavy cardstock, addressed in my cousin's neat handwriting. It wasn't from my mother. She would never extend her hand after what had already transpired, but it was clear whose idea the dinner was. Her 60th birthday, hosted in her own home, with the family gathered in formal dress beneath chandeliers and catered wine. I stared at the envelope for days, weighing the sting of returning against the weight of silence. My instinct was to throw it away, to stay in Pennsylvania, safe in my modest apartment and far from her gaze. Yet something in me knew this was the moment. I had in my possession what she had buried. The letter from Cormac. The unsent invitation. The truth was no longer a secret I carried alone. It was a weapon. When I walked through the doors of her lavish home that evening, the air hummed with celebration. Laughter spilled across the marble floors, relatives dressed in their best, champagne glasses in hand. But for me, the room felt like a battlefield cloaked in velvet. Every glittering decoration seemed sharpened, every smile rehearsed. My stomach tightened, but I clutched my purse where the letter lay, steadying myself with my father's words. Dignity is lived, not given. Dinner was served with ceremony. Silverware clinked, waitstaff poured wine, and conversations rose in waves, yet I felt the tension like a thread pulled taut across the table. My mother sat at the head, radiant in emerald silk, her voice carrying easily, her laughter commanding attention. To everyone else, it was a celebration. To me, it was a stage for confrontation. Halfway through the meal, I stood. My heart pounded, but my voice was calm. There's something I need to read. Chairs shifted. My mother's eyes narrowed. I reached into my purse and drew out the letter, unfolding the faded paper. My hands shook, but I held it steady before me. "It's from Cormac," I said, my gaze sweeping the table. Written before our wedding, I found it only recently. I began to read, my voice unwavering. "Valora, I love you, but I don't know if I can go through with this. Your mother has made it clear. If I marry you, I risk everything. She has threatened my reputation, hinted at financial consequences, and I'm scared of what she'll reveal. I thought about running away with you, just leaving it all behind, but I don't know if I have the strength." Gasps rippled through the room. Forks froze midair. My cousins exchanged startled glances. Uncles shifted uncomfortably. Across the table, Cormac stared down at his glass, face pale, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. My mother laughed, brittle and sharp. "A forgery. Or perhaps a misunderstanding. People say foolish things when they're nervous." But her laugh didn't hold. The edges cracked. My father's words burned in my chest as I pressed on. "He didn't abandon me because he wanted to. He abandoned me because you cornered him. You orchestrated everything." The room was tense, heavy with the sound of truths that had been buried too long. In American families, it's at weddings, funerals, birthdays, these supposed celebrations, that the silence finally cracks. Tonight, it shattered. Then came another voice. A cousin, voice unsteady but resolute, spoke up. "I heard her. Years ago. She promised him shares of the estate if he stayed. She said Valora wasn't strong enough, that he'd be better off siding with her." My mother's mask slipped. Her face hardened, the smooth performance falling away. "I did what was necessary," she snapped. "Everything I've ever done was to protect this family." "Protect?" I shot back. "You didn't just steal my wedding. You bought loyalty with money that wasn't yours to give." Murmurs rose around the table, relatives whispering, the sound growing louder with every word. My mother's power had always been her grip on narrative, but cracks were spreading. Her voice rose, desperate now. "You are bitter, Valora, ungrateful. Everything I've done has been for you." But then, one of the older relatives, an uncle who rarely spoke, set down his glass and said firmly, "We've heard enough, Isolde." Silence fell, heavy and complete. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply placed the letter down on the table for all to see and whispered the words my father had left me. Dignity is not given, it's lived. I looked around. Heads nodded subtly. Eyes that once glanced at her with admiration now looked to me with quiet acknowledgement. In that moment, I realized something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, she wasn't the center of the room. I was. And I hadn't even raised my voice. The morning after my mother's birthday dinner, I woke in my apartment with a heaviness in my chest, but there was also a lightness I hadn't felt in years. The truth was no longer a private ache I carried alone. It had been spoken aloud, and it had settled in the ears of every relative who had been at that table. For once, it wasn't just me against her. I lay still for a while, listening to the muted hum of cars passing outside, my phone buzzing every few minutes on the nightstand. When I finally picked it up, there were dozens of messages. A cousin wrote, "Thank you for saying what we were too afraid to." Another added, "You showed courage we should have had years ago." I stared at the screen, my eyes burning. Lies don't live long once light touches them. That thought steadied me, even as exhaustion weighed down my limbs. I brewed coffee and sat by the window, watching the sun break weakly through the clouds. My body was tired, but my spirit was calmer than it had been in a long time. I didn't reach out to my mother. I didn't need to. I knew she would be scrambling, furious. But my strength would be in restraint, not retaliation. I remembered her face the night before, how it had twisted between fury and fear when I read Cormac's letter aloud. That image gave me strength. My father's words echoed in my head. Strength isn't in shouting louder. It's in being the one who doesn't need to. By noon, the fallout had begun. Neighbors called relatives asking if the rumors were true. A family friend left me a voicemail, her voice tight with discomfort. "People are talking. Your mother. She looks smaller now. We never thought we'd see the day." In a community like ours, reputation is a kind of currency. Once it's tarnished, no matter how wealthy or influential you are, it's nearly impossible to buy back. And my mother's once untouchable reputation was collapsing under its own weight. I sipped my coffee, letting the silence be my reply to the chaos. What struck me most as the day unfolded was how my composure at the dinner table had taken on a life of its own. Cousins told the story in their own voices, relaying how I had stood with steady hands and read Cormac's words without a tremor. How I hadn't yelled or begged, but simply let the truth fill the room until there was nowhere left for her to hide. Even without anger, I had silenced her. And that silence echoed louder than if I had shouted. In America, we often admire the one who doesn't rise to bait, who holds steady while everyone else trembles. That night, unknowingly, I had become that person. It felt strange to hear my own strength retold through others, but it was empowering too. They didn't remember my pain. They remembered my poise. Meanwhile, my mother was busy dialing phones. I heard through a cousin that she was calling relatives one by one, spinning her story. She claimed she had only ever wanted to protect me, that she had intervened in my life because I was too naive to handle the world. But her hypocrisy was too stark now. Her voice, once commanding, sounded hollow when replayed by those who heard it. They were no longer convinced. They had seen too much. And then came the final blow. Astria Quill, one of my quieter relatives, someone who had always stood at the edges of family gatherings, spoke up. She told others that years earlier she had overheard my mother bargaining with Cormac. She had promised him property shares, inheritance, whatever he wanted, if he would stay by her side and not by mine. When Astria's words spread, there was no patchwork left for my mother to stitch together. Her credibility was gone. I received a message that evening from another cousin. "You were right all along. We should have believed you." I put my phone down, exhaling slowly. For years, her lies had been stronger than my truth, drowning me out, painting me as the unworthy daughter. But now, I could feel the shift. The silence that followed her calls wasn't just embarrassment, it was abandonment. One by one, the people she had ruled through fear and manipulation were stepping back. For the first time in my life, my mother's lies weren't stronger than my truth, and she knew it. Weeks passed after my mother's birthday dinner, and the ripples of that night were still spreading. Back in my small Pennsylvania apartment, I felt both emptiness and freedom. Calls trickled in from relatives, some curious, some offering half-hearted sympathy, and others simply gossiping about what had happened. I ignored most of them. Distance had become my shield. There were moments I sat on my couch staring at the quiet walls, thinking of how much had been lost. I would never again be part of the family gatherings I once dreaded but secretly craved. Never again in the fold my father had tried so hard to hold together. And yet, in that emptiness, I also found peace. For the first time in years, I wasn't tethered to her control. In American families, stepping away often looks like betrayal. But for me, it was survival. Betrayal would have been staying in her shadow and letting her lies define me. Peace was in the leaving, even when the silence pressed hard against my chest. And I met Malis at our usual cafe, the one with chipped mugs and strong coffee that tasted like earth. She had driven in from New York again, concern written across her face as she slid into the booth opposite me. I exposed her lies, I told her, stirring my drink though I had no appetite for it. But why do I still feel so heavy? Malis leaned forward, her eyes steady. Because healing isn't about proving the truth, Valora. It's about choosing peace. Her words sank deep, though I wasn't sure I was ready to accept them. She always made me feel like I needed her approval to breathe, I admitted. Even now, part of me waits for a call, for her to say she was wrong. She won't, Malis said firmly. And you don't need her to. Independence isn't loneliness. It's reclaiming the space to grow. I sat back, my chest tightening, but there was relief in her bluntness. I realized with sudden clarity that I no longer craved my mother's approval. What I wanted was my own life, defined on my own terms. The conversation lingered with me long after Malis left. That night, I pulled out my father's journal again, flipping through the pages worn from my hands. I reread the wedding letter too, the one that had once broken me. This time, the words didn't gut me. They anchored me. His voice, written in steady ink, no longer tied me to grief. It pulled me toward strength. I found a blank page at the back of the journal and began to write. My handwriting was uneven, but the words were mine. I am my father's daughter, not my mother's shadow. As the pen scratched across the page, I felt something shift. I wasn't just living from his guidance anymore. I was creating my own. In America, journaling is often used as therapy, a way to transform pain into growth. Tonight, I understood why. With every line, I wasn't just writing, I was reclaiming. By the glow of a candle, I made a decision I should have made long ago. I stopped expecting an apology from her. Some wounds never heal because the person who cut them never admits it. But healing doesn't need their hand, it only needs your choice. I whispered to myself. She will never say she's sorry. And I will no longer wait. The weight slid from my shoulders. It didn't vanish completely, but it loosened, enough for me to breathe differently. I turned to the small joys I had neglected. I poured myself into teaching, finding light in the students who cared about the words I shared. I cooked meals that filled my apartment with warmth, meals no one criticized or mocked. I reached out to neighbors, laughing with them about ordinary things, weather, pets, traffic. Each act stitched me into a life that was mine, unchained. I realized then, family does not define worth. Dignity does. As I blew out the candle that night, the shadows slipped across the walls, gentle instead of threatening. My chest lifted with a breath I hadn't felt in years. I finally understood. Freedom wasn't waiting for her to change. Freedom was choosing to let go. Weeks after the confrontation at my mother's birthday dinner, the family suggested one last mediation. They called it a healing meeting, though I knew better. Still, I agreed to attend. Not because I expected her to change, but because I needed to end this on my terms. The dining room was smaller this time, stripped of celebration. The table was round, as though that might symbolize equality, but her presence still filled the space like a storm cloud. My relatives shifted uneasily, caught between loyalty and doubt. I had brought a small bag with me, not of clothes, but of truths. My father's journal, the hidden invitation, and the letter from Cormac. She began before I could even sit, her voice rehearsed. Valora has exaggerated everything. You all know how sensitive she's always been. I only ever tried to protect her. I placed my hand on the bag and looked directly at her. No. You don't get to write this story anymore. I do. Her eyes flashed, but I didn't let her speak again. I pulled out the journal, the invitation, the letter, laying them out like pieces of evidence in a trial. The room was silent except for the sound of paper sliding across wood. Faces leaned in, expressions shifting as their eyes caught the handwriting, the dates, the words. You said I was lucky he chose me, I said, my voice steady. But he did choose me until you cornered him. You silenced invitations, you dangled promises of inheritance, you rewrote history, and you thought no one would ever find out. The silence that followed wasn't just heavy, It was condemning. Her lips parted, then closed again. For the first time, she had nothing left to spin. Voices rose from around the table. My aunt muttered, "We enabled you for too long." Another cousin shook his head, disgusted. "All those years, and we said nothing." My mother slammed her palm on the table, her mask gone. "You're all fools." She's twisting this, making me the villain when I was the only one strong enough to protect this family. But no one supported her. Not a word rose in her defense. The very silence she once commanded had turned against her. I said nothing more. I didn't need to. The truth lay bare on the table, undeniable. Her power dissolved not with shouting, but with exposure. In American families, downfalls rarely come with fists. They come with acknowledgement. Tonight, hers came in the form of quiet nods and averted gazes. I stood slowly, pushing back my chair. For once, I didn't feel the urge to fight or explain. The evidence spoke louder than I ever could. My mother was left sitting at the table, her hands trembling, her voice caught in her throat. A week later, I found myself back at the cemetery, the winter air crisp against my skin. I carried an envelope, not of hers, but of mine. Inside were her lies I had uncovered, the invitation she had hidden, and my own reflection written in my hand. I knelt at my father's grave, placing the envelope at the base of the stone. My fingers lingered there, pressing the paper into the cold earth. "Dad," I whispered, "I carried your words when I couldn't carry myself. Today, I return them with peace." Tears welled but did not break me. Instead, they cleansed. Closure isn't forgetting. It's choosing to stop carrying what was never yours to hold. I stood, leaving the envelope behind. The stone, the flower I laid, the silence. They were enough. Walking back to my car, my shoulders felt lighter than they had in years. Revenge had never been about destroying her. It had always been about reclaiming me. I understood now that justice wasn't her downfall, it was my rising. Driving away, I thought of the future, teaching, writing, maybe even loving again. Not defined by her, not in reaction to her, but on my own terms. Sometimes justice is not seeing them punished, it's seeing yourself rise without them. For the first time in years, I wasn't running from her shadow. I was walking toward my own light.